Declaration of Arbroath, as it's called, is a letter that was drafted by the government of Robert I, Robert the Bruce, and sent in the name of over 30 barons to Pope John the 22nd on the 6th of April 1320. And the whole thing was crafted by Robert I's government a couple of weeks earlier, and its immediate context is the intense pressure that Robert I's government was under from the papacy and therefore the international community to stop trying to be independent and to acknowledge Edward II of England as overlord. And given that Robert I was at that stage in control of virtually all of Scotland, that was never likely. Eventually, right towards the end of Robert I's reign, independence was secured in the Treaty of Edinburgh in 1328. So as a text, throughout the Middle Ages, it was very significant. But the most important thing to say about its significance is that, like all texts, that significance changes according to how it's read. So initially, it was incorporated into the standard history in Latin of the kingdom, particularly because of its graphic few sentences about the terrible atrocities that Edward I had committed against the Scots in his conquests of 1296 and 1304. If you look at the way readers reacted to that history, the bits they were particularly keen on was a sentence which referred to Scotland having 113 kings of their own, unbroken by any foreigner. Today, the bits that catch the imagination most are how they're going to keep fighting as long as there's a few hundred of them alive. And the other bit is the statement that they will support Robert Bruce through thick and thin. However, if he should give up the struggle and submit to the King of England, then they will get rid of him and they will elect somebody else to be king instead of him. This kind of aspect of the text, however, wasn't picked up in the Middle Ages. It wasn't that important, but it becomes more important from the 17th century. That's maybe its most important role in the Scottish sense of having a long history of not just seeking independence, but this idea of popular sovereignty as well. It's been therefore a source of inspiration and pride to be able to point to this document in 1320 and say, there it is, it's there already.
What was the Treaty of Union? Was the Scottish Parliament a parcel of rogues whose votes were bought and sold for English gold? Did England colonise Scotland? To understand where the Scottish independence movement is today, it's important to contextualise the constitutional developments that have led to today's tensions. Most significantly, in 1707, the Act of Union was signed, which united England and Scotland and Wales as the Kingdom of Great Britain. This meant a unified parliament, the abolition of the parliaments in England and Scotland as a result, and where the Parliament of Scotland had 157 members, Scotland's representation in this new parliament was reduced to 45 seats in the House of Commons and 16 peers in the House of Lords. Among other provisions, the Act provided for a common currency between the countries and also provided for a Protestant succession to the crowns of Scotland and England. A number of key factors came about to bear, which resulted in parliamentarians ratifying the treaty. Firstly, religion. Following the Scottish Reformation, led by John Knox in the 16th century, the Calvinist doctrine, a strong branch of the Protestant church, spread across the country with great influence, particularly on Scotland's educational system. This, of course, came into contention with the Catholic monarchy during the 17th century, so the guaranteeing of a Protestant succession in the Act of Union was a key motivator for many in reinforcing Protestant religious hegemony in Scotland. Secondly, the Scottish economy. Scotland faced domestic tariffs and challenges in terms of agricultural output, and also trade tariffs implemented by its English neighbours, which had led to an attempt to establish a colony at Darien in Panama, which dramatically failed and lost up to a quarter of Scotland's liquid capital. A Treaty of Union therefore offered some redress for this economic hardship. England had the military power to coerce and the fiscal power to persuade. Given that England was as much, if not more, in need of a political association, the question remains whether Scottish politicians made best use of their negotiation options. with factional politics determining party positioning in the Scottish Parliament and indeed individual members' interests as well as the broader European state-building consensus of the time, whereby traditionally fractured smaller states across the European continent were being more centralised into larger state entities. Despite this coming together of states, Scotland maintained a distinct identity within Great Britain, not only with its unique educational system, but also the guaranteeing of a distinctive judicial system by the Act itself. Come the 19th century, and after successive attempts to characterise Scotland in national narratives as North Britain, famed novelist and poet Walter Scott played a significant role in romanticising Scotland the brand ahead of a visit by King George IV. It is from this period where tartanry, kilts, bagpipes and romantic imagery of the Highlands all emerged as prominent in constructing an invented tradition through which the elites could maintain cultural and political dominance. Nevertheless, this has meant that Scotland has clung on to its independence of character in such a way that political activists and idealists have been able to organise around a coherent idea of Scotland as a nation. Over the 3 centuries that followed the Treaty of Union, the gradual development of further state infrastructure distinct to Scotland, such as the Scotland Office and eventually the new Scottish Parliament, within the structure of the United Kingdom would be the result of various efforts to bring greater social justice to Scotland. The Treaty of Union should not be seen particularly through the nationalist lens, and a reading as such would make it easy to misrepresent Scotland and its contribution to the world through other structures such as the British Empire, where Scotland was a hub of manufacturing and industry and would support the importing of goods produced through the slave trade and make rich the businessmen of Scotland's cities. Rather, the Treaty of Union was, as Neil Davidson has put it, a bourgeois revolution from above that sought to guarantee the interests of Scotland's governing class, in particular the Protestant Church and Scotland's wealthy nobility. As with each step in the progress of Scotland's constitutional change, the material interests of the ruling classes have dominated the ability for proper change to take place, and as such kept Scotland's poor and destitute subjugated to the interests of finance and capital, which so often overlap with the interests of the British state.
There was a sharp increase in support for a Scottish Parliament from the late 1960s. By the 1980s, Scotland's voice was totally neglected in the British Parliament, and that led to a growing demand for action in Scotland. So we managed to establish the Scottish Constitutional Convention by bringing together the majority of Scottish MPs, almost all our local authorities, our trade unions, our churches, and a range of other civic bodies in Scotland. And the aim of the convention, with that democratic base, was to prepare detailed plans for a Scottish Parliament. The convention came together in 1989. By 1991, it had prepared these proposals, and it was very much on a consensus basis. But the British government at that time refused to take any action on this. And it wasn't until 1997, when we had a change of government, that we had the legislation for a Scottish Parliament, and it was the convention scheme. And this was supported in a referendum that year by 74% of the population in Scotland. So this was a very real example of democratic participation by the people of Scotland. And there was real support for this. Not everyone supported independence. There was majority support at that time for a devolved Scottish Parliament, but it was a strong legislature. And one of the most important things that the Constitutional Convention declared at that time was that it acknowledged the sovereign right of the Scottish people to choose the form of government that met its needs. And of course, that recognition of Scottish sovereignty is so fundamental. It is the recognition of the sovereign right of one of the oldest nations in Europe.